Well, hey, Josh, thanks for being here today. We're going to have a really fun conversation.
Warren, it's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me on, bro.
Yeah. So, what I want to start with is actually a line from your own website. You have on here, and I'm going to read it to make sure I get it right, even though it's not long. You have all men are created to be leaders, but not all men lead. I think it's a great way to just start a conversation since we're talking to guys. So, unpack that a bit. What do you mean by that when you say that?
Yeah, what I mean by that is if we go back to Genesis and we look at the account where God first formed man and woman, and he blesses them, and then he gives us a mandate. It's a fivefold mandate. It's called the dominion mandate in Genesis 1:26 to 28. And he commands man to be fruitful, to multiply, to subdue, to take dominion, to conquer, and to replenish the earth. So everything we're touching is multiplying. We're supposed to subdue our enemies and really take the territory and expand this sphere that God put man in, the original man in the garden. And obviously, we know that man failed there, but that dominion mandate, which really we can boil down to saying it's really about leadership. That leadership mandate that Adam was charged with does not change for us as men in the New Testament, in the New Covenant. As men following God, we are created to be leaders. Now, there's an order to taking dominion. There's an order to leadership that I discovered, Warren. And it's first, we have to learn how to lead ourselves. And this is really that journey of self-mastery. We can call it self-control. We can look at it and align it with one of the fruits of the Spirit. But it's really about leading yourself. And what I've discovered in my life is that as I lead myself, it qualifies me for the next level of leadership, or we could even say the next level of dominion. And that's to start to lead those around me. And then I can get to the place where I'm actually leading in my world. So I believe we can take the original mandate that God put on man in the garden, still applies to you and me right now, today, and it's about leadership. And we can spend probably an entire episode breaking down what leadership is, but from a top line strategy, it's really, can I lead myself? And that's going to qualify me to lead others and to move into positions of promotion and exhibit servant leadership and all the characteristics and traits that God has ordained me to walk in as a man of God.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And one of the things that you just mentioned there, the one of the last points there on servant leadership,
Yeah.
that's such a great phrase, but a lot of times people don't quite understand what that means. So from your perspective, when you're using that phrase or when you're thinking of that phrase or talking to other guys and you're talking servant leadership, what does servant leadership mean to you?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? It's certainly been popularized, right, by self-development. It's in every career, every industry is talking about servant leadership. Probably John Maxwell, Ken Blanchard are the two guys that made it popular in the corporate arena to start using this Jesus language, this Jesus model of leadership, and bring it into a corporate environment, to an entrepreneurial or business environment. So when I speak about it, I'm talking about the leadership that Jesus exemplified when he walked the earth as Son of Man. And I know we're going to get into it, but I wrote this book called The Standard: Discovering Jesus as the Standard for Masculinity. And in the book, it's one of the characteristics that I break down where we look at what does it really mean to be a servant leader and how is this different than the leadership of the day. So I think to really understand this, Warren, we have to look at, in a biblical context, what was the leadership that was modeled in the era that Jesus was walking the earth? And we know, and I know you're very astute to the Bible and you've done some amazing work in this area, with the tools and resources you create for your audience and the men you serve. We know that leadership was really seen as the governmental force of Rome over Israel. So to be a leader would be a king ruling and reigning over subjects and keeping them in force, in lockdown under the position they're supposed to play. So we have this lordship model for ruling, which is what you would have saw in first century. And Jesus breaks onto the scene, and we know everyone was looking for the conquering Messiah. They're looking for the person that's going to set them free from their physical oppression. And Jesus did not come to fulfill that role in the way they expected. And instead, he takes the form of a servant. And if I think of like one biblical passage or one biblical account where we see this really exemplified, it's when they're in the room about to eat Passover and Jesus kneels down and washes their feet, which would have been totally humiliating for them. You know, if you even look at the scene, they all rushed into the room. No one even thought about washing their feet, washing Jesus's feet. And here he is taking the lowliest spot, which really exemplifies his whole approach to ministry, that he emptied himself and he's exhibiting the characteristics of a servant while he's a king. And to me, that's servant leadership, man, is modeling the way. Now, we take it just practically as well. I've been fortunate to build teams, to lead high performing teams in the sales arena and in my corporate expression of what I do. I think servant leadership is also modeling the way. It's also saying, hey, let me roll up my sleeves and show you what I'm asking you to do. Let me tell you why. Let me show you why it works. And I'm going to demonstrate it and show you first so I can model it and be it. And then I cause the rest of the team to rise to that occasion because they can see it exemplified versus someone who's just barking orders at someone else.
Right. Right. Yeah. And the barking orders thing, you can get stuff done that way sometimes. But at the end of the day, in the bigger picture, that guy doesn't last usually. That guy's not gonna he's not gonna be around, in round two and round three and round four. And so in your conversation there, as you're talking about that, you mentioned Jesus a couple times,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where I'd love to go with most of our conversation here is Jesus as the standard for masculinity. And in today's culture, even the phrase masculinity is confused.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts about just today's culture and the idea of masculinity? What are you thinking about that?
Yeah. It's a very confusing subject, right? And hard to navigate right now, because there's so many conflicting views. So right now, I mean, Warren, let's just take this from a 30,000-foot view, because you and I both hold to, and your audience holds to, a different worldview. So we understand that what we're seeing play out right here is really the effects of this cosmic battle we're in with light versus darkness, right? It's two kingdoms colliding, and they're fighting for territory. They're fighting for who's going to take possession of what's happening here and who's going to control the next move. And so we know that we're not wrestling against human people. So whenever we talk about these ideas and what's under attack and who's attacking us, let's just frame this conversation, that both of us agree that there's unseen forces and unseen realms that are looking to manipulate man and take him away from his destiny as God has appointed him to walk in. So with that understanding, we see that there is this attack on manhood. And I'm going to say at the most fundamental level, it's an attack on the image of God first and foremost. So God made us in his image and his likeness. And right now, the war's raging. Everything we see, even with the most present day news topics and what we're arguing over and every social issue, is erasing gender. It's erasing male and female. And years before we even got to this point, it was all about toxic masculinity. So there's this attack on what is masculinity, what's it mean to be a man. And in the book, The Standard, that's what I seek to set out, is to talk about your masculinity is God-given, that God made man and woman with differences. And we both express different sides of his nature, his character. And when we're walking in the full expression of that, it's very powerful, but it's also been diluted because there's all these lies and there's this, the news cycles that we have to navigate through of feeling guilty or feeling pressured or whatever the world wants you to think about your original operating design.
Yeah.
I'll let you take it from there and we
Yeah.
can just start this
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah. So one of the points you mentioned in there is how currently folks are struggling with what is masculinity. So shifting from today's culture and masculinity, where do you go for answering that question? What is masculinity? What are your thoughts on that? Where do you go on that?
Yeah. Well, if we look in the Christian sphere, we're going to find a lot of Bible studies on a array of vast biblical characters that we can look to and that we can model. I think a favorite one is David, right? A man that was after God's own heart. He has some failure in his life. We can identify with him, and we can go on from one biblical character to the next. And there's so much we can learn, and that we can get from every single man of God throughout the Bible. But what I've found, what I've experienced, is that a lot of times we overlook Jesus as a model for masculinity because we've made him so unapproachable as Son of God that it's like, hey, I can't even fathom being like Jesus. That just sounds like crazy. I'd rather let's talk about David because that makes sense to me,
Yeah.
right? He failed, and Jesus is sinless. He's 100% God and 100% man. He's God man. So how can I even look at him? And I've spent some time in like you have in various men's ministries. And I would often hear things like, hey, we're just going to keep trying and we're just going to keep going. Hey, well, I'm not Jesus, right? And it was this real feeling of defeat. And I was getting such a sense of failure from guys that I was around that were just looking at like, hey, I'm just trying my best to live the Christian life and I'm not that good at it. And I'm just going to, grit my teeth and just try a little bit harder. And hopefully I make it through this thing. And what I've discovered is that's not the model that we're supposed to be living by. And so what I attempt to unpack in the standard is really showing, and this is, I'm not the only one who broaches this subject. One of my favorite authors, Major Ian Thomas, he made the statement that said, Jesus is man as God intended man to be.
Mm.
That Jesus is not only, and this is what we break down in the book, is that we know he's 100% God. He's the Son of God. But Warren, you know this, when he walked the earth, his favorite self-descriptor was Son of Man.
Yeah.
So he's always identifying with his humanity because he came as the second man, the last Adam, to fulfill something and to be our representative on earth. And he's walking out this human existence in humanity, in flesh and blood. And we really need to look at that. And that's something that I feel has been overlooked. And when we get a hold of it, it's very powerful because he's setting the standard for how we're to live in his humanity so we can follow him in our humanity.
Yeah. Yeah, and he was a man. Sometimes not to do a self plug in the middle of talking with you, but I wrote a book, Jesus Man to Man, and
Awesome.
that's part of it. Is well, just sit down and talk with Jesus, and what would that conversation be like, and could he relate? Because we so often do that. We elevate him into a position that he becomes unrelatable, and Jesus was he was a man. He had a job. He went to work. He probably went to work on days he didn't want to go to work, and he was like, I could go be teaching people right now, but I've got a job, I've got commitments, I've got responsibility. He was a man. And
Yeah.
there's the danger of going too far in that direction too, and saying he's too man, and then we sort of forget the God element. So finding that balance in between is critical, because if we're looking to him as the standard, remembering that Jesus was a man changes our ability to relate on just the stuff that we're going through in life. And one of the great lines that I always love is one of Jesus's best miracles is, here's a man who's got 12 good friends.
Mm.
Because we're in our world today where so many men are just trying to lone wolf it, and they're
Yep.
trying to just, I'm going to do everything my way and pull myself up from my bootstraps. I'm the guy, I've got the plan, I'm going to do it all. And one of those standards that Jesus set for us is not to go alone. So what do you think about that? The guys who are doing the lone wolf thing?
Yeah, amazing. I want to make a comment first on what you said
Yeah,
because
sure.
I love these hidden years of Jesus, right? He's in obscurity. He's in a season of obscurity, probably till around age 30, right? And we don't have a lot of documentation on that time, but one of the best comments that I get from people that have read the standard, and I'm sure with your book, Man to Man too, is that they see Jesus in a new light. Like, yeah, he had to punch a clock every day. He had to deal with customer service. He had to deal with, someone that was unhappy with the product maybe, or deal with all the difficult things that we have to deal with. And I think that's huge for men to be able to relate and understand that when we see that verse, that he can identify with all of our trials, all of our temptations. He walked through all of those things that you and I walk through. We
Yeah.
have some different modern day challenges, but at the heart of it, what he did on a daily basis is not it is so similar to what you and I deal with in that season of obscurity. And
Yeah.
I'll actually add this because I learned this and I saw this from a different perspective a few years ago from a different author where, we don't have a lot about Joseph, but we know Joseph, his earthly father figure, passed away at some point. And Jesus would have also had to carry, as the firstborn, have to carry the load for the family. So there was a part of that where he was providing and he was in this work thing, waiting for the perfect timing of his father to be released in the ministry, but he's got a lot of obligation. So today, I mean, we're all under stress, we're all under pressure with the obligations of the day. With we have to, meet these bills and these deadlines and timelines. And Jesus had all of that as well, being the father figure for his family for probably a number of years before he's released into his ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, without question. And we have this little bit of his life when he's about 12 years old and he's teaching at the temple, and mom and dad are like, "Hey, where you been?" And he's like, "I'm here in my dad's house doing my thing."
Right.
Why? Like, what are you looking for? And then yeah, he sort of comes back on the scene when he's about 30, like you said. And in the middle of there, he's doing what men are supposed to do. And we tend to forget that he would, had his friends, probably joked around with them just like every
Yeah.
other 20-year-old, and so yeah, he lived that life. And having, I want to come back because I do want to get your thoughts. He
Yeah.
had his friends, and he could have done life by himself. He could have set that standard. He could have done whatever he want, but the standard that he set for us was have your guys, have your friends. And even in his 12, he had his inner circle of like his best friends, his closest guys that he was walking the walk with. So what back to that
So back
point
to
as
the lone
well. Yeah,
wolf.
love to get your thoughts on that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's look at where this concept came from, right? Because I don't know about you, but I was born in the 70s, mid 70s, but I grew up in the 80s. So I grew up with Schwarzenegger, Stallone, JCVD, obviously Bond is across all the generations. So we have this picture we're presented with of this lone wolf that goes in, takes care of business. He's the hero. It's the hero story in every movie. And then we kind of model that. And that's what we emulate in life. When we view ourselves that way, we take on this character of this is the way I'm going to win at life. And it's totally in contradiction with what Jesus models and what he shows us. So if we first look at God himself existing in Trinity, right? It's a picture of community within God himself. And then as you spoke about, Jesus comes onto the scene and he assembles a tribe of men. He walks with 12 guys that he's going to mentor, he's going to apprentice, they're going to be disciples. They're going to, follow the dust of the rabbi, and they're going to go everywhere he goes, and he's going to do life with them. And then the next model he gives us is that he gives us a model of community in church, which is the ecclesia, which is never to be done alone, never to be done in isolation. So I actually would say you can't even live the Christian life alone. It was never the intention. Even if we look at going back to the garden, there's four metaphors for what God was looking for, and this is part of his eternal purpose is that it's a family, it's a building, it's a bride, and it's a body. So those are all metaphors of a multi-membered body, multi-membered family, and that's what God was looking for, and that's what we see Jesus exemplify. So in terms of the myth of the lone wolf, we know and like, hey, Warren, let's acknowledge this. Like lone wolves are strong. Like it doesn't mean you're weak if you're a lone wolf. I think why
Right.
that message is appealing is because a lot of guys listening, and myself included, I can do a lot on my own. I have done a lot on my own. And then the real question is, how much farther, how much more can I accomplish? How much farther can I go in God's purpose and plan for me if I'm running with the right community?
Yeah.
Because the first thing Jesus does when he finds his guys is he extracts them from their current location and he puts them into a new environment. And we see that's the model where he assembles this model of community. He models it, he teaches it, and he teaches like that's how they're going to thrive. There's going to be vulnerability, there's going to be honesty, there's going to be correction, there's going to be teaching and coaching. And all of that happens in community and cannot happen in isolation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a dangerous trap because it does speak to part of us, the lone wolf. And yeah, I'm a little bit older than you, born in the late 60s for me, but
Okay.
same thing. Watched all those guys, watched all the action stars, watch them take on the world by themselves and win. And like that speaks to us. So like, oh man, I'd like to do that,
Yeah.
I'd like to be the one guy taking on, the whole army in order to save the family. Like I want to do that. And so yeah, there's that element that speaks to us. But you mentioned in there, church isn't isn't meant to be done alone. We're not even meant to do this by ourselves. And there's a great old story of a man who's going to church pretty regularly, but he gets burned out of it. He gets tired of it. He feels like it's the same messages over and over and over, and he's got other things he wants to do on Sunday. So he starts to stay home. And one day he's at home and his pastor comes to the door, and they go out in the backyard and they make a little fire, and they're just sitting around the fire. And the pastor's not saying a word. And he takes an ember out of the fire and he sets it on the side out of the fire. And the other man just watches it as it cools down and cools down and cools down. And then he picks up the ember and he puts it back in the fire and it heats back up. And the other man says, "All right, I'll be there Sunday." And the pastor leaves. You know, we have to realize that we need other guys around us when we're trying to do it by ourselves. You might go faster, but you're not going farther.
Right. And we love the quote, and it's really famous in Christian circles, even non-Christian circles, that iron sharpens iron. We love that proverb. We love to quote that. But if you think about that process, even Warren, like iron sharpening iron is a violent clash, right, of two objects colliding like high velocity to sharpen another instrument. That doesn't happen in isolation, right? That happens through challenge, that happens through confrontation, that happens through someone calling you out, like on
Yep.
how you're showing up in the moment. So I think those are all really powerful metaphors. They're easy to say and they become cliche, right? But to actually live it and to
Yeah.
walk it and then submit yourself to the process. Like, hey, I'm submitted to this. Like another man can call me out across the table and I have to answer for my actions or how I'm showing up or how I'm not showing up.
Yeah. And on that point, on the calling out point, one of the things guys need to realize with that is the in order for a person to call you out, they actually have to know you.
Mhm.
They have to know what's going on in your life. And that's where you can say, I've got my buddies we hang out with. That guy probably doesn't know you well enough to do a call out. Yeah, if there's something, big and obvious that everybody on the planet does, but the subtle things, the stuff you're struggling with internally, the stuff between you and your wife, the stuff between you and your kids, he has to know you. He's got to know your world. He's got to know your family. He's got to be on your, in your inner circle in order to call you out. And so sometimes guys will say, well, I've got my buddies, we hang out all the time. But if they don't really know you, if you don't really know them, you can't even do the call out, because
Right.
how are you supposed to call the guy out? You don't even know what's going on really in his world. You just know we like the same football team.
Right. Right.
Yep.
Totally. I mean, we're accustomed to keeping our armor on, right? It's all part of the lone wolf metaphor or motif, right? We want to look tough or we want to look strong, and it's hard to admit weakness. It's just hard for a man to show a vulnerability. And so when we're around each other, it's easy. I mean, what's the first thing we say when we meet each other? Usually for the first time, hey, what do you do? What do
Right.
you do for a living? And what comes out is this measuring system. And really what we're looking at, it comes down to status. Who has more status? And the man who has more status feels strengthened. The man with less status, whatever your value system is, however you're evaluating status, for most in America, it's going to be your bank account or what you do or your income level. And then from there, it's like, hey, I'm going to show off this this presentation that I want to give to the world. And that's what I'm going to project to everyone. So it's rare. We need to find more communities where we can take the armor off, where we can let the shield down and we can open up so true transformation can take place. Or else we can look it on the outside, but a lot of those guys are really hurting on the inside.
Yeah. Yeah. So from community, and we talked a little bit about, we started to get into Jesus as the standard, and he
Yep.
has his friends. He's given us this example of community. He's given us this example of having other guys around. What's something else that Jesus set a standard for us as men about, when it comes to masculinity, being a man living in this world? What's something else that he set a standard?
Yeah, it would be helpful, Warren, if I just give you the structure to how I wrote this book, because this
Sure.
is the
Sure.
cheat code for how I put it together and what I feel the Lord gave me and what I develop in the book. So I looked at the life of Jesus in 6 dimensions. So I looked at self-leadership, which is his self-mastery, the way we started this conversation with. What's it look like to lead yourself? And what are those characteristics and traits that Jesus modeled as man that we can exemplify and we can also follow him in that area. Then we look at leadership. We look at the way he leads others, the way he leads his world, the way he leads his team. And we start looking and unpacking at what leadership looks like in terms of leading others. Then we look at communication. What's the style of communication that Jesus uses? And one of the things we see is that he always pulls people. He never pushes. So for every section of the book, there's 6 sections. I use a picture. It's an illustration. I actually used an artist to come in and draw these. And for the communication, it's a fishing net because it's the perfect metaphor for you have to pull people towards you. And that's what he does with the way he ministers, the genuine interest and the way he gets on their level and he connects and builds trust. And, you made a comment when we were talking about the 2 types of leaders, right? And one boss, might just arm himself in his title and everything's power and control. And it's not really the servant leadership like we were discussing earlier. Well, that's a man that's always going to be using force. And Jesus never does that. He always exemplifies, he models, and he pulls people in the direction that he wants them to go, usually by asking questions. He'll ask over 300 questions and only answer around 3. So that's also another attribute of his great coaching style. But moving on, we also look at empathy and the role of EQ. And right now, there's a lot of data that shows that your EQ is going to be the highest determinant of your wealth, of how much wealth you can actually make is going to be connected to your EQ. Now, it will depend on the industry you're in, but those that have the ability to foster, establish trust quickly are going to be people that are usually more successful. And Jesus certainly demonstrates a high level of empathy and EQ. And then after that is confrontation. We look at the way he confronts, the way he brings a sword, that he separates, and that he brings confrontation, usually standing up for the weak and going against the religious crowd or anyone that's standing in the way of anyone coming to his Father. And then lastly, we wrap it up with love, and that's really the message that he carried to the cross. It's the work of the cross, but also the way of the cross. So self-mastery, leadership, communication, empathy, confrontation, and then lastly, love.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great way to sort of break that down. I love those categories that you have there. And in one of them, when you were talking about there, and you mentioned the questions
Mhm.
that Jesus uses, and yeah, he loves to answer questions with questions. And I'm curious for you, if you're working with a guy, if you're talking with a guy, what's 1 or 2 of your favorite questions to ask him from your perspective? Now, we're not talking about Jesus. This is for you personally. What do you
Yeah.
like to ask guys?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, first of all, we have to understand like where they're coming in at, right? So I think just there's so many open-ended questions you can use. Just to,
Mhm.
hey, it could be as simple as this, Warren. I'll tell you a story that happened to me from someone who's a mentor in my life. I was a little younger at the time, but they just said something as simple as, "Hey, so tell me what's going on." And I went into this like 5 or 10 minute like diatribe of just spilling my guts. And then I looked up, I said, what was the question? And he goes, I just asked you what was going on. And I'm like, I
Yeah,
just told you everything that was in my heart at that
yeah,
moment because it was
yeah.
so full and I needed to talk to someone. So I think open-ended questions obviously are what's going to open someone up. There's so many. I mean, it could be as simple as, first of all, like, hey, tell me what's happening in your life right now.
Hmm.
But I think the more important part than just the question, because it's not just about a strategy, a tactic, or just give me this checklist. I think it's really about your position and your demeanor as a coach or someone that's there to facilitate change. Because what we see with Jesus, we can certainly take all his questions, and there's books of all of his questions, and I think they're extremely valuable.
Yeah.
But then I think the part that takes more diligence and discipline is pausing and just holding space until that man breaks the silence and tells you what's really going on. So that I would say is as valuable, perhaps more valuable to have the discipline not to speak and close the silence, but to be comfortable with the pause. And that's really a coaching technique. But for anyone who's like, hey, I'm a type A, I'm a driver, I'm a firstborn, that takes a lot of diligence. And that's a learned skill that I had to learn even in the sales process when I was selling. Not to keep speaking and keep talking, but to learn when to stop and now just wait for the response.
And what's so sort of fun about that is the wait for the response. It's actually not that long. People think I'm going to have to sit here in silence for 10 minutes, and there might be a very outlier situation where you're waiting for a long time, but we're usually talking a matter of seconds. It's just that people are so unused to silence that 3, 5, 7, 12 seconds of silence feels like an eternity if we're not used to that, but it's 12 seconds.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
it's not actually that long. And yeah, sitting in that silence is great. I do want to stick on the personal side
Yeah.
with you. Something I'm always curious about when I talk to guys, especially guys like you who've written a couple books and do this work. This is usually not where, and I'm gonna assume this, even though I haven't asked you this before, this is usually not where you thought you'd be when you were 16, 17, 18 years old. So maybe so, but what was your journey of growing up as a kid, going through life, and ending up where you are now, where you're doing this work and you're helping men with these things, and you've got your podcast and your site, you're like all the stuff you're doing. How did that happen for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll give you the 30,000-foot view, and then you can feel free to go wherever you want to go with this.
Sure.
So first thing is I grew up in a Christian home. I had a good family environment, a dad and a mom in the house. But my dad worked a lot and was always was made every effort to be at all my stuff, but couldn't be at all my stuff all the way through my whole life. But the Lord was really gracious and always brought other men into my life. So I had my father, but I also had what I'll call like my big brothers, like my mentors that the Lord would bring in. And it was a camp counselor. It was my youth group leader. And it seemed like if there was a season where we needed some extra attention, we, meaning me and my brother, the Lord would bring in a godly man that was just there for us. And then I happened to find myself in churches where there were just strong men. There was a strong leadership presence where I just enjoyed it. I liked being, it felt safe. It felt like, wow, this is real leadership. I got it at home. I got it from my big brothers, my mentors. I got it from my pastors. And so I've always had that. When I get into the business side, I started right out of school. I launched a business. I connected with a successful entrepreneur within my family. We started a business together. So I had two business partners, did that for about 5 years, thought it was going to be the dream. I'm like, this is amazing. Like success is inevitable. And what I learned was, wow, running your own business is hard. This is really challenging. And it wasn't everything I thought it was on the outside. Somewhere along that period, it was a huge learning for me. I was young. Somewhere along that period, I decided, I was getting married, and I decided like, hey, this isn't the life for me right now. I had 3 retail stores selling fitness equipment. It was really grinding me down. I was working in the business, not on it, full retail, and just got married. And I'm looking forward to like, hey, what's the next chapter of my life? So I made a decision that it's time to step away from this business and actually follow my youth group leader's lead, who was in pharmaceutical sales. So reconnected with him, asked if there's any chance he could even look at my resume. Do I even got a shot at this? Like, I'm just like this small town kid, and I'm a little bit rough around the edges, Warren. I'm not polished. I'm not corporate. And he turned out to have an opportunity. He was now promoted. We've been disconnected for a few years. There's a huge story behind it where the Lord sovereignly just opened up the door. I'm like, I'm going to walk through this and see what happens. I went to my mentors, my pastors, my coaches, like that wisdom of counselors. And I felt the green light to say, hey, let's walk through this and see what happens. And that led to what's now a 20-year career with 6 different positions. Of the best way to explain it for your listeners is it's like a Joseph story. I went into this
Mm.
foreign land called Egypt, and I got trained in the ways of the world. And I went through a lot of different varying positions. I got a lot of different experiences. I learned things that I could never learn in church. I saw excellence at a whole new level. I got training in the world systems and coaching and sales and all the stuff that I do. And that was amazing. And there were certain seasons in that where I was all in on my career, but I still feel like I have this call from God on my life that's much deeper, and I'm not defined by what I do. And I think I wanted to be defined by it for a little bit. Some guys are I was looking for status with, having a higher income. I was that guy. I was looking for like, hey, if I get a job title, I'm going to feel really good about myself. And then I got it. And then I'm like, okay, like there's definitely more than this.
Yeah.
And so I've always had this pull. Like I had this pull from the Lord, like always taking me deeper in a different direction. He wasn't saying walk away from the corporate world. He put me there He's promoted me and I've prospered there, but all for skill sets and all for talents that I can use in the kingdom. So on that journey, I was appointed to, with my wife, we were deans of a ministry school. It was a lot of admin, but we were overseeing a ministry school. There'd be times that I'd be tapped to lead the small groups and oversee things there. And then it would go away. And it would be like a season of all professional development. And it was like, hey, I'm in a season where I'm focusing all my extra time on the business because of the position. And somewhere around 2016, I just started reading the Bible and the gospel specifically with a fresh lens. And now I'm a little bit different because now I have this experience, Warren, of like being in corporate and leading teams and hiring people and firing people and just seeing all these different leadership strategies and methods. And now I'm reading the Gospels and I start to see things that I've never seen before because I wasn't just reading the words of Jesus. Now I'm reading into the story and I'm like, wow, look at what he's doing.
Yeah.
Like, look at the way he asked that question. Look at the way he's leading his team. Oh, look at the way he demonstrates EQ in that situation and builds trust, which led to the next engagement and the next open door. And I could see all these pieces fitting together. So I never set out to write a book. I never set out to say, hey, I'm going to start some kind of ministry. I knew that there's a call on my life and I just want to follow that in whatever season the Lord has me in. But somewhere along the way, from just kind of doing my own journaling, I said, I think I have a book here. And then it changed from a little hobby to a responsibility that I have to finish this. And it took 4 years. It never set out to say, hey, I'm going to write a book and get it done. And then I finished it. And you know what I did, Warren? Nothing. I sat on it. And I was really scared because I'm a perfectionist. And I said, Lord, I don't know what to do with this. Like I wrote it. Do I have to release it? Like, I don't really want to put it out there. And that was in March and I didn't release it into May. So a few months went by and it was in May where I really felt I heard the Lord and I got a word that said, hey, now's the time. And if I didn't do it at that time, I felt I was going to cross over to being in disobedience. So,
Mm.
so I released the book and then a year later, started a podcast, a lot of fear of failure, a lot of perfectionism. I think I did a podcast for probably a year and like made one or two posts about it. In fact, I still don't like posting things I do. I don't like the self-promotional aspect of it. But part of that was fear. It's like, hey, I don't want to tell everyone what I'm doing. And then that led into, as you grow, you step into your call, you become more mature, you get validated by the Father, and you feel like, okay, this is what I'm focusing on right now in this season, and I need to stay focused on what God's called me to do. So that's how I do what I do. Hopefully that answers your question. Feel free to go wherever you want with that.
Yeah, no, it's just always fun to hear guys' stories. You know, how do you get from point A to point B, and there's just always amazing stuff that's happening along the way. We don't see it in the time, especially if we're in the dark places. We don't see what's going on, but God's got his plan and he knows where he's taken us to. And it's just great to hear folks and hear guys' stories on that. Something that you did mention in there, you talked about you were at some churches that had some strong men.
Mhm.
And we have a lot of churches from my perspective. I don't have actual survey data on this, but we have a lot of churches from my perspective that don't have that. We have
Right.
a lot of churches in Western culture in the United States where there are not a lot of strong men there. Maybe there's a man who is the pastor up front, and
Mhm.
he's the one who is preaching the sermon, sharing the message, but not a ton outside of that. So having those strong men in church is huge. And what are your thoughts on that? The importance of having strong men. You talked about, other guys that kind of came around you. We talked about not doing the lone wolf earlier, but
Right.
other men who can mentor you, who can help you along the way, other strong men in church. What's the value of having that in your life? Because some guys might say, I'm doing okay. I don't really need that. What would you say is the value of that?
Yeah, well, so first of all, if anyone's listening to your podcast, I'm going to assume, and if they don't know, I'm going to tell them right now, your listeners, that you have a growth mindset and you need to have a growth mindset, right? Jesus calls us into a process. You're saved for a goal, and that goal is going to take a process. So, what you heard me tell with my story is part of the process that I went through. It's a process of growth. And Warren, I feel so convicted about this that we need to have men we're pursuing. We need to find someone in our life, a mentor, a teacher, a coach, that has something you want. They're doing something that you want to do. They're living the life. It doesn't mean they have to be this huge entrepreneur. One of my first mentors that I really pursued, um, when I was younger, is a gentleman that just had a really powerful prayer life. And I said, I want to be like him. And he was a associate pastor there. And I took him out to lunch and I said, you have something that I want. I need to learn from you. And this guy is nothing like my personality. He's so meek. You would probably look at him and say, like, that's the guy, Josh. Like, yeah, he's different than me, but I saw something of eternal substance and value that I needed in my life. So I pursued it. I invested in it. I took him out to lunch. I took him out to dinner. We set up a time where we met regularly and we actually prayed together because that's what I wanted to learn from him in that season. So I think every man has to find someone that they're looking for and they're modeling. So let's talk about how we got here, right? We know, and I'm sure you've talked about this in the past. I've talked about in the standard, just a short little blurb on, the feminization of Christianity. After the Industrial Revolution, men left, we went to factories. And what happened is, the church became inhabited mostly by women. The guys left, it got more feminized, pushed more men away. And that's we still have some of the residue of that in a lot of churches. I think mega church culture has changed that. That's not as feminine. We see more organizational structure there and a strong man on the top. But certainly, we're not in a place where we see strong men. And it's interesting you're bringing this up because I actually have an opportunity to minister this weekend,
Mm.
and I'm bringing my son with me. He's 13, and I asked what the ages were, and I'm allowed to bring him. And I think it's so important that we have our young guys with us, that are boys. And why do you, as a man, need someone you're following so you can get a real vision for your life of who you're called to be, strength of character, of your walk with the Lord, whatever the Lord's highlighting to you in the season you're in. Sometimes we go from mentor to mentor. It's okay for different skill sets and different competencies that we pursue. But we also have to be imparting that into someone as well. And so we can start right where we are. We talked about leadership. So lead yourself. The next stage is lead your family. So for any married men here, are we investing in our kids? It's something that I have to be real cognizant of, Warren, because I am leading a group of men right now, and I do speak to men one off. And I have to remember that I'm never to neglect my sons. Like, they're right here. Like, they're my priority in my family. So there's so many opportunities. So why is it important? Because we need to raise up the next generation. That's the charge. And God is generational when he gives us a family, that model of family that we can lead others, and that every man here, I believe, has a skill set, has something they can impart to someone else. And if you don't impart it, if you don't find that outlet where you can teach, where you can train, where you can model, where you can just exhibit servant leadership, you're not going to reach your full potential if you don't pour into others. Like, even on this conversation, like, by me speaking with you, by me listening to you, Warren, I get sharpened. I'm receiving what you carry, and you're allowing me, your platform, to share some things the Lord showed me. And in that exchange, we both grow by giving and by receiving.
Yeah. And I love that you included the family aspect there, because too many men are outsourcing to church, and they're thinking, okay, my church will take care of that part of my kids' upbringing. That's our responsibility. A phrase I have said often is, church is there to help you. It's not there to replace you. And you can just look back at the Old Testament. We're one generation away from unbelief.
Mhm.
And if you're not actively teaching your children, and that's your responsibility, dad, if you're listening to this and you're the dad, that is your responsibility. Yes, you have a great church. I'm hoping you have a great church, and you have a pastor, and they're teaching the Bible on a regular basis, but that is your responsibility to teach your kids, to talk about Jesus, to talk about the Bible, to talk about scripture, to talk about all of the lessons that Jesus shared throughout his time on earth. That's your responsibility. It's not somebody else's job. It's yours. And sometimes that can feel heavy because a guy's like, well, I've already got all this in my world. I've got my job. I'm the one taking care of the car when it breaks down. Like, I've got everything else. Now you're telling me I have another job.
Right.
Yeah, I am actually. Your job is, as leader of your family, is teaching. That is one of the things that you are called to do. You can't just hope everybody else does it. We were talking earlier about the culture we live in. That 1 hour, I'll assume it's an hour, that 1 hour on Sunday, that cannot counter every other hour of every other day. You have to be intentional about that. You have to take that responsibility serious because it's you. The Bible is telling you that that's your job. You've got to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, Deuteronomy 6 really is the model for families and fathers, right? We see that we're charged to raise the next generation. And, I love church. I think it's so important, the ecclesia, that we don't abandon that and that we have that corporate expression. But Warren, I'll just tell you straight up, like I gave up looking to get fed on a Sunday morning. Like I have to feed myself, right? I go there to contribute to corporate worship. Yes, we're hoping we get a good word and we're hoping that, you're getting sharpened there, but I can't eat once a week and then think I'm going to have spiritual nutrition, right? I
Right.
have to eat every day. I have to learn how to get my food, prepare it, and learn how to go from milk to meat. And the same thing with my kids. They go to a Christian school, but that's not good enough. Memorizing a few Bible verses and just being in this cultural Christian environment, they need to have their own personal encounter with God. So I'm always looking for how can I facilitate that growth
Yeah.
and how can I set up the environment where there's a learning lesson? And we talked about coaching, right? And learning how to hold space. We got to do that with our kids. So if someone like phased out on that part of the conversation saying, hey, I'm not a coach or I don't really have those relationships, you do. You have them with your wife, you have them with your kids to learn how to ask an open-ended question and wait for the answer and to develop that and pull things out of them and use it as a teaching and an impartation where you can share your knowledge, your wisdom, and give them what they need.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I love that. We need to take that seriously. It's similar to when guys say, "Well, I just work a job. I'm just a piece in the puzzle. I don't lead anybody." And then I'll ask them, "Are you married? Yeah. Do you have kids? Yeah." Dude, you're a leader. Like, it's this is not a corporate thing we're talking about. So as we're getting close to the end of our hour here, one of the things I always like to do is to make sure I give guys an opportunity to share something that we may have just touched on and really didn't get into it far enough, or a point that we didn't touch on at all. I know we kind of bounced around topics. We
Yeah.
started with this idea of Jesus as the standard for masculinity, and we kind of moved around a bit. But what's a last point, a final point you'd like to leave the guys with?
Yeah, we talked on a few subjects, and Warren, I really appreciate this conversation, and thanks for having me on. Um, I want to go in a little bit deeper into that lone wolf idea and tell you what I'm seeing right now. And I'm going to present you with three categories of men. I think every listener is going to find themselves in one of these three categories. I talk about this in my latest book, Kingdom Driven, and I'm going to give it to everyone for free if anyone wants it. Stick around to the end of the show, and we'll drop that website. But the point is, I see this road. You just presented a picture of a man who's shrugging leadership, who's saying, hey, I'm not a leader, right? Like, hey, I'm just a cog in the wheel. I just do this. Like, men that are listening right now, you need to understand that God created you with a leadership mandate, a purpose, and a call. And your job, your calling is to uncover and to discover where God wants you and to not wait for the perfect opportunity or not wait until you get the promotion, but how can you start affecting transformation in yourself and around you where you find yourself right now? And when you're on that road, I have my own internal vernacular, but I call it kingdom driven. You're driven to expand God's kingdom, not your own kingdom, but you're there because you're cooperating in partnership with God. So, like, let's think about this picture of you're on this road. And when you're on the middle of this road, you have vision, you have purpose, your skill sets, everything's coming into convergence. You may not always feel it, but you're operating in your design and in your mandate. But the problem is, Warren, there's ditches on both sides of this road. And ditch one is exactly what you just described. I call it the Mr. Christian Nice Guy syndrome. It's this passive guy who's just waiting for opportunities to fall into his lap. And it's associated strongly with a victim mentality, right? Like, hey, that guy did this. If only that was me. If only, like, if you find yourself saying, if only I married a different person, if only I came into a different family, if only I had a different job, right? You're exhibiting qualities of this passive Christian nice guy, which basically is summed up by the mantra of if it's meant to be, it's meant to be. God's going to open it up for me.
Yeah.
Now, there's a flip side. The other side of the road is where we find this rise and grind mentality, which I call orphan alpha syndrome. And this is a guy called an orphan because they don't know their father and they're trying to grind in their own willpower, in their own strength. And we're so conditioned. It's that lone wolf you described. That lone wolf is strong, can knock doors down, knows how to build things, knows how to use grit, grind, and hustle to get things done. But then you're wondering and always second guessing, am I really doing what God called me to do? Or did I just do all this on my own? And I don't want to be that guy. And I don't want to be this guy over here. Like, and I've been both. So how do I get onto the center of the road? That's the real conversation. And for that, you're going to need a couple things in place. But I want to point out that there's two ditches, and you have to ask yourself, where am I? Have I been playing the victim, asking God to do everything for me and just waiting with no effort from myself? Or have I been doing everything in my self effort, rooted in the flesh, where I'm not submitted, I'm not cooperating, I'm not surrendering? And when we put those things together and we just lay it down and we walk with God on this road, and the key is partnership. What's that look like? That I take action, but that God empowers me to take action. And this is this picture of partnering and co-laboring. And we have all this language where we have the great commission, right? We're called into co-union. We're called to co-labor. So it's this picture of partnership where we're working with God. We're not just working for him, and we're not just walking without him, but we're actually walking with him.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. And that's a great picture to leave guys on, that's what we should be striving for, is walking with him. And I love that. So if guys want to connect with you, they want to learn more about you, they want to learn about your books and all the stuff that you're doing and what you have to offer, where do they go to find you? Where do they go to do that?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Warren. Standard59.com, standard59.com is my site. If you want the book Kingdom Driven, I'll give this to you for free. Just go to kingdomdrivenbook.com and you can grab a free copy.
Awesome. Awesome. I love that. I'll make sure to include those links for everybody. Josh, it was great talking with you today. Have a great rest of your day.
Warren, it's been an honor. Thank you, brother.
Hey, before you go, please make sure you subscribe to this show and leave a review. 5 stars is, of course, the desired number of stars. So be like all the cool kids and do that. Enjoy the next show, guys.